During the height of counterterrorism operations in the early 2000s, when military organizations across the Western world were refining their understanding of special operations, a particular incident unfolded that exposed a fundamental philosophical divide in how different nations approached the same mission. The British Special Air Service, or SAS, had been tasked alongside American forces with conducting an infiltration operation into a heavily fortified area where hostile elements were believed to be consolidated. The objective was straightforward in declaration, yet complex in execution. An intelligence target needed to be acquired or eliminated depending on the circumstances the team would encounter. The location was hostile territory, the enemy presence was confirmed, the stakes were significant. The intelligence briefings that preceded this operation had been extensive and meticulous. Intelligence analysts had spent weeks assembling a comprehensive picture of the target location and the forces defending it. Satellite imagery had been analyzed repeatedly. Human intelligence sources had been cultivated and debriefed. Intercepts of enemy communications had been processed and evaluated. The intelligence officers presented their findings with measured confidence. The target building was a reinforced structure that had been modified over time to accommodate defensive measures. The defenses around it reflected both deliberate construction and the accumulation of sandbags, barriers, and obstacles that had been added over months of occupation. The garrison force was estimated conservatively, suggesting a force larger than previously observed. American command had established the operational parameters for the mission well in advance. These parameters reflected decades of American doctrine, shaped by extensive combat experiences across multiple continents and refined through countless after-action reviews. The protocol was clear. Teams inserting into hostile territory would carry weapons appropriate to their expected threat level. They would carry primary weapons, backup weapons, ammunition in quantities calculated for worst-case scenarios, and additional magazines distributed across their operational load-bearing equipment. They would carry grenades, both anti-personnel and non-lethal variants. They would carry communications equipment, medical supplies, and signaling devices. The entire package was designed to ensure that when American soldiers went into contact with enemy forces, they would have every advantage possible available to them immediately. The American approach had been validated repeatedly in the field. Teams that had operated with comprehensive ammunition loads and multiple weapons had survived encounters that would have resulted in catastrophic losses if they had been attempting to conserve ammunition or function with minimal firepower. The doctrine was not derived from theoretical considerations, but from the hard lessons of actual combat operations. American commanders had seen situations deteriorate rapidly when forces ran short of ammunition. They had seen situations where a firefight that was supposed to last 5 minutes instead lasted 50 minutes because the enemy had reinforcements that had not been anticipated. They had seen situations where the firepower available to a team had been the only factor that stood between success and failure, between survival and death. These experiences had created a doctrine that prioritized ammunition, firepower, and the capacity to sustain combat operations even when circumstances became more complicated than anticipated. The SAS team assigned to support this operation understood these expectations. The men selected for this particular mission were among the most experienced operators in the regiment. These individuals had spent years conducting operations across multiple theaters of conflict. They had operated in the deserts of the Middle East, in the mountains and valleys where conventional approaches to warfare proved ineffective, in reconnaissance missions where the ability to move undetected took absolute priority over firepower. They had developed a particular approach to mission planning that prioritized objectives over force projection. The SAS as an organization had evolved over decades into a force that was comfortable operating with minimal support and in circumstances where the traditional advantages that larger military organizations could provide were simply not available. The SAS philosophy reflected different historical experiences than those that had shaped American doctrine. The SAS had been created during World War II as a small commando force operating behind enemy lines, where engaging in a major firefight was often impossible or undesirable. The regiment had continued to emphasize small unit operations, individual operator competence, and the ability to accomplish objectives without necessarily calling in massive fire support. The SAS had learned to work with smaller ammunition loads and had developed doctrine around the idea that an operator who was heavily laden with ammunition would move more slowly and be more likely to be detected. The briefing for this specific operation took place in the Operations Center, where maps were displayed on the walls and intelligence photographs covered the tables. American officers presented the situation. The target location was surrounded by multiple defensive positions. Sentries rotated on 4-hour cycles. Vehicle patrols moved along the perimeter every 30 minutes. The main structure had been reinforced with sandbags and concrete obstacles. Windows had been blocked or covered. The number of hostile forces inside was estimated between 12 and 18 individuals. The distance from the insertion point to the objective was approximately 3 kilometers across terrain that offered minimal cover. The distance from the objective to the extraction point was another 2 kilometers through equally exposed ground. The terrain analysis had been particularly detailed. The ground between the insertion point and the objective was a combination of rocky outcrops and open areas where visibility extended for significant distances. The approach to the target location would require negotiating several shallow wadis and navigating around existing fortifications constructed by the defending force. The SAS team members studied the topographical maps carefully, committing the terrain features to memory. They identified potential routes that would provide maximum cover and concealment. They identified lines of sight from the known defensive positions and planned their approach to minimize the possibility of being silhouetted against the night sky or moving in a pattern that would alert sentries to their presence. As the briefing progressed, American planners outlined their recommended approach. A larger force would conduct the actual assault, moving in with overwhelming firepower once the SAS team had established positions that would allow for suppressive fire. The American soldiers would move in with substantial ammunition loads, anticipating a significant firefight. The plan called for the SAS team to provide high ground support and blocking positions to prevent enemy escape. The plan was methodical and relied on superior firepower to overcome any tactical complications. The American concept of operations assumed that the defenders would resist, that they would attempt to reinforce their position, and that the operation would require sustained firefighting. The assault force would move into position quietly during the hours of darkness. Once in position, the assault force would initiate the operation with a barrage of suppressive fire that would keep the defenders pinned down and unable to mount an organized defense. The SAS team would provide support fire from elevated positions. Casualty evacuation plans had been prepared. Air support had been coordinated to be on standby. Medical personnel had been pre-positioned near the extraction area. Every contingency that American planning could anticipate had been addressed. When the SAS commander heard this briefing, he listened intently but said relatively little. The men under his command watched his face, and those who knew him well could see that something about the proposed approach troubled him. The SAS commander had operational experience across multiple theaters and had seen plans that had looked good on paper fail when circumstances changed. His instinct, developed through years of operational experience, was that this plan assumed a conventional firefight would develop and that overwhelming firepower would be the decisive factor. After the American officers finished their presentation and invited questions, the SAS commander asked a deceptively simple question. He asked whether there was any possibility that the objective could be achieved without a major firefight. The American officers explained that stealth was a possibility, but that in a heavily defended location such as this one, maintaining stealth while accomplishing the objective seemed unrealistic. They noted that if the team was discovered, They would need firepower to fight their way out. The SAS commander nodded. He understood the American perspective, yet the SAS commander's question reflected a different assessment of the situation. From the intelligence that had been presented, the defending force was not expecting an attack and was positioned to defend against external threats, not against operators infiltrating their position from inside their perimeter. The intelligence suggested that the main structure itself was not as heavily defended as the exterior perimeter. If a team could get past the external defenses and into the main structure without being detected, the actual task of securing the target might be relatively straightforward. The challenge was not the objective itself, but the approach to the objective. The American plan addressed this by using overwhelming force. The SAS commander wondered whether a different approach might be possible. That evening, the SAS commander met with his team. He explained the mission in detail, showed them the intelligence photographs, and walked them through the terrain features and the enemy positions. Then he told them what he wanted to do. He wanted to see if they could get in, accomplish the objective, and get out without being detected. He wanted to do this with minimal equipment, move fast and light, and have each man carry only what he absolutely needed. He explained that weapons would slow them down, would make noise, would be cumbersome inside the target building. He wanted to move in with personal protective equipment, with tools for the job at hand, and with minimal ammunition beyond what they would need for self-defense if discovered. The team understood what he was proposing. It was a risk. It was fundamentally different from the American approach, but it aligned with how the SAS had been trained and how the regiment approached operations. It reflected a philosophy that saw speed and precision as superior to firepower when the mission circumstances permitted. It assumed that trained men, operating with intelligence and focus, could accomplish objectives without triggering the massive firepower engagement that American doctrine assumed would be necessary. The SAS commander presented the specific concept. The team would move from the insertion point using the same routes that the American force would use initially, but would take longer to get to the objective because they would prioritize stealth over speed. They would move slowly through the terrain, stopping frequently to listen and observe. They would approach the external defenses carefully, identifying gaps in the sentry coverage and routes between the defensive positions rather than attempting to overrun those positions. Once inside the outer perimeter, they would navigate to the main objective building, breach entry using tools rather than explosives, accomplish the objective quickly and efficiently, and extract the same way they had come in. The team members discussed the concept. There were questions about contingencies. What if they were discovered before reaching the objective? What if there were more defenders than intelligence had indicated? What if the extraction point had been compromised? The SAS commander addressed each question. If discovered, they would have enough ammunition to conduct a fighting withdrawal. The team included men with medical training, so minor casualties could be treated immediately. The extraction point had been selected with multiple routes in mind, so if one route was compromised, others could be used. The American forces would be positioned to provide support, but the goal was to execute the operation in such a way that none of these contingencies would actually need to be employed. The team trained for the operation with the concept in mind. They practiced moving through darkness without visible light sources that might alert defenders, practiced breaching techniques that would allow them to get through doors and barriers quickly and with minimal noise, practiced moving through confined spaces inside buildings, and practiced the specific task that would constitute the objective, rehearsing it repeatedly until the team members could accomplish it in their sleep. They practiced their communication procedures so they could coordinate with each other and with the American forces using minimal radio transmission. Every aspect of the operation was rehearsed to the extent that such rehearsal was possible without actually being on the ground in the target location. When the SAS commander informed the American officers of his plan, the response was measured but clearly concerned. The American officers explained that this deviation from the established protocol was not acceptable, that the risk to the team was too high, and that if the team was discovered and pinned down without sufficient firepower, they could not be effectively reinforced. The SAS commander listened. He understood all of these concerns. He assured the American officers that his team was prepared for this approach. He asked for permission to proceed with the modified plan. What followed was a period of negotiation that reflected the complex relationship between Allied Special Operations Forces. American command was reluctant to approve the plan. The SAS commander was resolute that this approach was superior. The conversation went up the chain of command on both sides. British military leadership was consulted. They supported their commander's assessment. They noted that the SAS had been operating this way for decades with considerable success. They argued that the specific approach to mission planning should be left to the operational commander, who would be responsible for his men's safety. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The SAS team would proceed with the lighter approach that the commander had proposed. The American forces would position themselves to provide rapid support if the SAS team encountered unexpected resistance. The operation would proceed with the understanding that this was an experiment in different tactical approaches, and that the results would be carefully evaluated. The compromise was not entirely satisfactory to either side. The American command remained concerned about the risk to the SAS team. The SAS commander understood their concerns but remained confident that his approach would succeed. The American commanders agreed to the plan, but insisted on certain conditions. The SAS team would maintain continuous radio contact with the American forces. If the team made contact with the enemy, the American forces would move to provide support. If the team was discovered and forced into a firefight before reaching the objective, they would request support, and the American forces would respond immediately with all available firepower. The SAS team would extract to the designated extraction point, and if that extraction point was under fire, they would extract to an alternate location that had been prearranged. The insertion happened at night, as these operations typically do. The SAS team moved from their staging area toward the target location under cover of darkness. Each man carried minimal equipment. They had their primary sidearms, a limited amount of ammunition, tools for breaching doors and obstacles, communications equipment, and medical supplies. But they did not have the heavy ammunition loads that American soldiers carried. They did not have the numerous grenades and explosive devices that would be standard in an American assault. They moved as quickly as the terrain and the need to avoid detection would allow. The approach to the target location required careful navigation. The men moved in single file when the terrain permitted, spreading out when they needed to avoid presenting an obvious target. They used the darkness to their advantage, moving through low areas where they would be less visible against the sky. They paused frequently to listen for any indication that they had been detected. The defensive positions around the target location became clearer as they got closer. Sentries were indeed on guard, and their positions matched what the intelligence had indicated. The team members moved around these sentries carefully, ensuring they were not discovered. The route into the target area proved to be more challenging than the reconnaissance had suggested. One of the defensive positions had been moved from where it had been located during the most recent intelligence collection. This meant that a gap that the team had been planning to use was now partially covered by a different sentry position. The SAS commander made an instant decision to alter the route. They would approach from a different direction, moving through an area that the intelligence had suggested was relatively open ground. This route would take them closer to the perimeter for a longer distance, but it would avoid the newly repositioned sentry. The team adjusted their movement pattern and continued toward the objective. As they moved through what the intelligence had identified as open ground, the team discovered that the terrain was actually far more complex than the satellite imagery had suggested. There were outcroppings and small canyons that had not been visible in the overhead imagery. Some of these features provided excellent concealment. Others proved to be dead ends that required backtracking and finding alternative routes. The team moved through this terrain carefully, understanding that while the darkness provided concealment, the rocky terrain could make noise if they were not careful. They used light disciplines, moving from one area of concealment to another, pausing in darkness to listen before moving again. The most critical moment came as the team approached the actual target building. A sentry was positioned near the main entrance, and there was no way to approach that entrance without either being seen by this sentry or taking significant time to find an alternative route. The SAS commander made a decision. A team member moved forward with deliberate care. The sentry was focused on the perimeter, watching for external threats, not expecting anyone to be inside his immediate vicinity. When the team member got close enough, the sentry was neutralized before he could raise an alarm. The neutralization was done with minimum force and minimum noise. The operation continued. The SAS team member who had neutralized the sentry had trained extensively for this type of close-quarter action. Hand-to-hand combat in the SAS was taught with the primary objective of neutralizing threats quickly and efficiently without creating an alarm that would alert other defenders. The sentry had been approached from behind, had been quickly disabled, and had been positioned in a location where his body would not be immediately discovered if another sentry passed by. The team continued their infiltration without any indication that the external defenses were aware of their presence. Inside the target building, the team found what they were looking for. The intelligence had been accurate. The target was indeed present. The team accomplished their objective with precision and efficiency. The entire operation inside the building took minutes rather than the extended firefight that American commanders had anticipated might be necessary. The objective was accomplished with such speed and efficiency that anyone inside the building who had been unaware of the infiltration remained unaware. The team worked with practiced efficiency, accomplishing what had been tasked in less time than had been allocated for this phase of the operation. When it was time to leave, the team moved back out the way they had come, retracing their steps through the darkness and across the exposed terrain. The extraction from the target building went smoothly. The team exited the way they had come in, retracing their path back through the inner areas they had navigated to reach the objective. They moved back out through the infiltration route they had used to enter, navigating around the sentry positions that had been their primary concern on the way in. They moved past the position where the sentry had been neutralized, noting that the sentry's absence had not yet triggered any alarm among the other defenders. The SAS commander maintained radio contact with the American forces, providing situation updates and confirming that the team was proceeding according to the plan. The extraction point was where American forces had been positioned to provide support if needed. The SAS team arrived at the extraction point, having completed their mission without a single shot being fired in anger. Not a single member of the team was injured. Not a single alarm had been raised that would bring additional enemy reinforcements down upon them. The operation, from the perspective of the objective and the safety of the team, was a complete success. What happened next is where this incident becomes a significant moment in the history of inter-allied military cooperation. When American command learned what had actually transpired, they were deeply concerned. The SAS team had entered the target location without weapons, had neutralized the sentry using hand-to-hand combat techniques, and had accomplished the objective without any of the firefight that had been anticipated. From a mission success standpoint, this was clearly a positive outcome. But from a doctrinal standpoint, American command viewed this as a protocol violation of the most serious kind. The American command began to document their concerns immediately. Officers were tasked with gathering all information about how the operation had actually been executed. Debriefing sessions with the SAS team were conducted and transcribed. The SAS commander was asked to provide detailed explanations of his decision-making process and how the operation had actually proceeded versus how it had been planned. The complaint that was filed by American Command reflected their genuine concern about force protection and the established procedures that had been developed over years of military experience. The complaint noted that the SAS team had entered hostile territory with inadequate firepower for the expected threat level, had engaged enemy forces without the ammunition and support that American doctrine considered essential for survival, and that while successful in this instance, the operation represented an unacceptable risk that could not be repeated. The complaint was formally documented and forwarded through the chain of command on the American side. The complaint expressed specific concerns about what American Command saw as a fundamental violation of force protection principles. The document noted that the SAS team had been operating in an environment where they had known hostile forces were present, where they had known those forces were armed, and where they had known those forces outnumbered the SAS team members. American doctrine held that the team should be carrying sufficient firepower to handle the worst-case scenario where they were discovered and forced to fight their way out. The complaint noted that the SAS team had been carrying only sidearms and minimal ammunition. The complaint further noted that the SAS team had neutralized a sentry using hand-to-hand combat techniques. From the American perspective, this was extremely dangerous. What if the sentry had been more alert? What if there had been other sentries in closer proximity who had heard the commotion? The complaint suggested that a properly equipped team would have handled this threat differently, either avoiding the sentry entirely or using firepower to neutralize the threat from a distance that would have provided greater safety margins. The SAS response to the complaint was professional but firm. The SAS command acknowledged that the operation had differed from the standard American protocol. They explained that this difference reflected a different philosophy about how special operations should be conducted. In situations where stealth and precision could achieve the objective, placing an emphasis on stealth and precision rather than firepower made sense. The operation had been successful precisely because the team had prioritized speed and stealth over firepower. Had the team been heavily armed, they would have moved more slowly, would have been more likely to be detected, and would have been more likely to trigger the very firefight that the American protocol was designed to handle. The SAS response included specific tactical analysis of how the operation had unfolded. The intelligence had indicated the defending force was positioned to defend against external threats, not against infiltrators operating inside the perimeter. Once their team had successfully navigated the external defenses and reached the main objective building, the actual task of accomplishing the objective had been straightforward. The defenders had no reason to expect an infiltrator inside the perimeter, which meant they were not prepared to deal with one. The SAS team had been able to accomplish the objective without triggering any alarm or any response from the defending force. The SAS response also addressed the issue of the neutralized sentry. Avoiding the sentry entirely would have required taking a longer route that would have consumed more time and exposed the team to additional defensive positions. The decision to neutralize the sentry had been made with full awareness of the risks involved. The SAS team member who had performed the neutralization had been extensively trained in close-quarter combat and had executed the neutralization in such a way that it had not created an alarm. This was exactly the kind of tactical flexibility and individual operator competence that the SAS doctrine emphasized. The incident was formally documented. It became the subject of after-action reviews and operational debriefs. It was discussed in military educational institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. It represented a moment where two allied military forces with different philosophies about special operations came into contact with each other's fundamental assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. What this incident revealed was that there is no single correct way to approach special operations. American doctrine had been developed for specific circumstances and threat environments, prioritized force protection through overwhelming firepower, and reflected the experiences of large military organizations. The doctrine was sound, based on real combat experience, and had saved American lives. But the SAS philosophy reflected different experiences and prioritizations. The SAS had developed an approach that emphasized operator skill and judgment. It treated the individual team member as capable of making tactical decisions in the moment, rather than as part of a larger machine that would rely on standardized procedures and firepower to overcome obstacles. The SAS approach worked when the situation permitted it to work. It allowed smaller teams to accomplish objectives that might require larger teams. The SAS had spent decades refining this approach across multiple operational environments and had developed doctrine and training that supported it. The fundamental disagreement between the American and SAS approaches reflected different assessments of risk. American doctrine assumed that being discovered and having to fight one's way out was a serious risk, and that, therefore, carrying sufficient firepower to handle such a situation was essential. SAS doctrine assumed that being detected and having to fight one's way out was a risk that could be managed through superior operator skill, situational awareness, and the ability to navigate around enemy positions. Both doctrines were attempting to manage risk. They were just assessing the sources of risk differently. The complaint that was filed became famous within special operations circles, though the specific details remained classified for many years. Everyone involved understood that the incident represented a moment where different Allied approaches to the same problem had been tested in real operational conditions. The Americans had their way of doing things. The British had their way of doing things. Both approaches had merit. The question the incident raised was not whether one approach was entirely correct and the other entirely wrong, but rather what conditions would make each approach appropriate. In the years that followed, there was a gradual appreciation on the American side for what the SAS approach represented. American Special Operations Forces began to develop greater emphasis on small unit operations and on giving individual operators and small team leaders more latitude in decision-making. The emphasis on overwhelming firepower remained, but it was increasingly complemented by an emphasis on precision, stealth, and individual operator competence. American Special Operations doctrine evolved to incorporate the lessons from this incident and from other interactions with Allied Special Operations Forces. The incident never became publicly known in any detailed way. Both the American and British militaries respected the classified nature of the operation, but within the Special Operations community, it became legendary. It was told and retold as a story about how different military traditions approached the same fundamental problem. It was used in training to illustrate different philosophies about risk management in special operations. The SAS team members involved in the operation never publicly discussed it in detail. They understood that they had been part of something significant, not because of the combat that had occurred, but precisely because no combat had occurred. They had proven that a small team of highly trained, highly motivated individuals could accomplish difficult objectives without relying on overwhelming firepower. They had done this in front of their American allies. The SAS team members understood that their operation had implications beyond the specific objective. It was a statement about what was possible when operators were given the latitude to approach problems from a different perspective. The American officers who filed the complaint were not motivated by any desire to criticize the SAS. They were motivated by genuine concern about operational safety and by a belief that established protocols existed for good reasons. The complaint was not personal, it was doctrinal. It reflected a genuine disagreement about how risks should be managed in special operations. The fact that the SAS approach had been successful did not resolve the fundamental disagreement about whether such an approach was acceptable going forward. American command remained concerned that the success of this operation might lead to similar attempts in circumstances where the approach would be less successful, resulting in casualties that could have been prevented by following established protocols. In later years, when researchers and military historians began to examine special operations across different nations, this incident became a case study in how different military traditions approach the same challenges. The incident illustrated that there is no universal correct approach to special operations. There are approaches that work in specific contexts, with specific mission objectives and with specific enemy forces. The SAS had shown that an approach emphasizing stealth and precision could accomplish objectives that American doctrine assumed would require a major firefight. The complaint filed by American Command became known in some circles as the first formal protest against the SAS philosophy of operation. It was a protest that was never formally withdrawn, but that was also never used as the basis for removing the SAS from joint operations or for preventing the British from conducting operations according to their own doctrinal preferences. It represented a moment where two allies acknowledged their fundamental differences, documented them formally, and then continued to work together anyway. The relationship between the American and British special operations communities remained strong even after this disagreement, and both sides came to understand that disagreement on doctrinal matters did not necessarily mean that cooperation on operational matters could not continue. The operation itself, because it had succeeded so thoroughly, became evidence that could be cited on both sides of the doctrinal debate. The Americans could point to it as an example of unnecessary risk-taking that happened to work out but might not work out in other circumstances. The SAS could point to it as an example of how their approach could achieve complete mission success with no casualties and no firefight. The disagreement about whether it should have been conducted that way remained unresolved. What made this disagreement productive rather than destructive was that both sides continued to respect each other's perspectives and to cooperate on future operations despite the doctrinal differences. What the incident ultimately demonstrated was that military organizations with different histories and experiences develop different philosophies about warfare. These philosophies are not right or wrong in an absolute sense. The American prioritization of force protection through overwhelming firepower made sense given American experiences. The SAS prioritization of operator competence and stealth made sense given British experiences and the smaller size of the SAS organization. Each approach was rational and defensible. The complaint that was filed represented the American military's effort to maintain standards and protocols that they believed protected their soldiers' lives. The SAS response represented the British military's confidence in the capability and judgment of their most experienced operators. Neither position was unreasonable. Both were based on genuine military experience and genuine concern for the lives of soldiers involved. The disagreement was not between people who understood safety versus people who did not. It was between people who assessed the sources of danger differently. In the decades since the operation, military thinkers have continued to debate the relative merits of these different approaches to special operations. The American model has been adopted by many nations. The British model has influenced many others. Most modern special operations forces have developed hybrid approaches that draw on both traditions, emphasizing precision and operator judgment while maintaining sufficient firepower to handle unexpected situations. The SAS team that conducted this operation has never sought publicity or recognition for their actions. They understood that they had been part of a significant moment, but they also understood that the operation itself remained classified. What they knew, and what their American allies eventually came to understand more fully, was that there are multiple valid ways to approach special operations. There are circumstances where overwhelming firepower is the right approach, and circumstances where speed, stealth, and precision are the right approach. The key to successful special operations is understanding the specific circumstances and choosing the most appropriate approach. The incident with the complaint filed by American Command after discovering that the SAS team had entered without conventional weapons became a teaching moment for both military organizations. It illustrated the importance of clear communication between allies, the value of testing different approaches and learning from results, and that military innovation can come from willingness to try different approaches. It showed that disagreements about methods did not have to translate into disagreements about cooperation on subsequent operations. The SAS continued to conduct operations according to their principles and philosophy. The American military continued to conduct operations according to their established protocols and procedures. But both organizations became more aware of the alternatives, and both became more sophisticated in their understanding of when different approaches might be appropriate. The complaint that was filed became historical documentation of a moment when two allied militaries confronted their fundamental differences. Rather than resulting in lasting friction, the incident strengthened both organizations' understanding of their own approaches and their respect for alternatives. In the years that followed, stories about this operation spread through military circles, becoming legend and folklore within the special operations community. An SAS team had been tasked with a difficult operation. American Command had insisted on heavy weapons and ammunition loads. The SAS commander had argued for a lighter approach. The operation had proceeded according to the SAS commander's philosophy. The objective had been achieved with no casualties and no firefight. American Command had filed a complaint about the protocol violations. The SAS had responded with professional confidence in their approach. These facts became the skeleton of a story that was told and retold, with various embellishments and interpretations across the special operations community. What made this incident historically significant was not that it was a dramatic combat operation, but precisely the opposite. It was an operation that succeeded so completely that no heroic moments were necessary. It was an operation where the objective was achieved because the team understood how to accomplish it without triggering a major engagement. It raised fundamental questions about how special operations should be conducted and what the appropriate balance was between force protection and mission accomplishment. The incident demonstrated that the questions military theorists had been debating had real implications for how operations were actually conducted. The complaint filed by American Command became a document that encapsulated a particular moment in military history, when the certainties about how warfare should be conducted were being challenged by operational results that suggested there might be multiple valid approaches. The complaint represented an attempt to enforce standards at a moment when results were suggesting those standards might not be universally appropriate. Instead, it became part of the historical record, a testament to two allied militaries struggling to work together despite fundamental differences. The officers involved in filing the complaint understood that they were not criticizing the SAS for being unprofessional. They understood that the SAS team had accomplished something remarkable, but they also understood that the SAS approach violated protocols that existed for good reasons, and they felt obligated to document their concerns formally. The complaint came to be seen as documentation of a significant moment in military history. It represented leadership that was willing to advocate for their organization's principles while still maintaining respect for their allies. In the final analysis, the incident of the SAS Infiltration that prompted a formal complaint from American Command became a symbol of how different military traditions can approach the same challenge in fundamentally different ways. It became an example of how military innovation can come from willingness to question established procedures. The complaint that was filed became not an indictment, but a historical record of a moment when two allied militaries confronted the reality that there is more than one valid way to accomplish difficult military objectives. The incident stands as a testament to professionalism, to the value of inter-allied cooperation despite doctrinal differences, and to the understanding that successful military operations require not only sound doctrine but also the wisdom to recognize when alternatives might be appropriate.